An enormous rock falls and blocks the exit of a cave which 5 tourists have been exploring. Upon searching, one finds a hole and sends Big Jack through, but he is too big and gets stuck. In a backpack, someone finds a stick of dynamite that would blow up the wall and free everyone, but also kill Big Jack. The tide is rising and they must decide to drown and let Big Jack live, or blow up the wall and kill Big Jack soon. This dilemma relates to life because it puts us in situations like saving our own lives or saving others, where we have the right to save ourselves rather than the other people in the situation. These rights would come from ethics. Ethics is, per Manuel Velasquez, Dennis Moberg, and Michael Myers, standards of behavior that tell us how human beings ought to act in the many situations in which they find themselves. Ethics are important because they define an action made. Without it, actions would be aimless and disordered. There are many ways to approach this dilemma, but the two of them that stand out as the most practical, the utilitarian and the virtue approach. The first approach is the utilitarian approach. Velasquez, Moberg, and Mayer define this approach as the ethical action that provides the most good or does the least harm, or to put it in another way, produces the greatest balance of good over harm. This merely means that a person's life is their life, and they should base their actions on what they want to do, not on the actions and choices of anyone else. Velasquez, Moberg, and Mayer say that this approach tries to both increase the good done and reduce the harm done. With this approach, the thoughts and actions of someone else does not affect the person's choices in life. To put this into a real-life situation, in hospitals, the doctors give the option to resuscitate a patient if their heart stops beating. Deciding on whether to allow the doctors to resuscitate or not is an example of the utilitarian approach. It is the patient's choice, and no one else can affect their thoughts or input to persuade the patient to allow it or not. In the dilemma, the tourists have the right to either blow up the wall and kill Big Jack, or wait for the tide to rise and die themselves, but whatever they do is for their lives and not based off of killing Big Jack. With the utilitarian approach, the tourists would act soon and more than likely wait for the tide to rise and drown rather than killing Big Jack. This approach would mean that they would all be sacrificing their own lives for Big Jack to get out and live. In this, they would not try to cause as much damage and hurt, blowing up and killing Big Jack, and, as a team, choose to drown instead. They would base their actions on their thoughts of what would be the greater outcome of no harm. The second approach to the cave dilemma is the virtue approach. Velasquez, Moberg, and Mayer define the second approach as ethical actions ought to be consistent with certain ideal virtues that provide for the full development of our humanity. This merely means that a person's actions should consider the thoughts of the others around and the others that it would hurt. With this approach, the actions would be taken slow and would take all the thoughts of everyone into consideration. Velasquez, Moberg, and Mayer say the virtue approach enables us to act per the highest potential of our character and on behalf of values like the truth and beauty. In the real-life example from the first approach, if the patient chooses do not resuscitate, then the doctor or nurses must fight the want to resuscitate the patient and help fight for their lives, causing the what-if thought. The doctors not resuscitating and fighting the urge to help the dying patient is an example of the virtue approach. If the patient does not allow it, then the doctors cannot take the patient's lives or the feelings of the patient's family into consideration. In the dilemma, the tourist would take the time to carefully analyze the situation, all the possible outcomes, and what type of person it would define them as. With this approach, the tourist would take the time to talk to every person in the cave, including Big Jack, and consider their thoughts and feelings in the situation. They would probably decide to drown because the thought of killing Big Jack to save themselves would haunt them. They would base their actions on the thoughts and feelings of everyone in the cave, especially Big Jack. The comparison between the utilitarian approach and the virtue approach would be that both serve the right of doing what is best for their lives. Both only focus on one leg rather than everyone else around. Being put in situations of having to choose between two things becomes stressful and confusing. These approaches lets the person decide to not become afflicted by the thoughts of everyone else and to stay focused on doing what is for the greater good of their self. Though both approaches have their similarities, the utilitarian approach says to base the actions off doing good rather than harm, while the virtue approach says one should always base their decisions off honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self-control, and prudence. The utilitarian approach also says to decide as one, only allowing this criticism of others when they are involved in the dilemma, while the virtue approach says to consider others' lives in the situation. For the dilemma with the tourist stuck in the cave, the utilitarian approach is the better of the two approaches because it is based off a self-decision and what is thought as the greater good of the others. The most reasonable thing for the tourists to do is allow the person who found the dynamite to be in charge and make the decisions for the group. This approach specifically allows for quick thinking in bad situations rather than wasting time on fighting and overthinking. Applying these approaches allows for a broader range of thought during a situation, but all are to help determine the right approach to use at the time.